Is the Federal Reserve independent? The nuanced answer is sort of, but the real answer is no. But this is probably the biggest myth that is told at business schools and in economics classes and many other educational endeavors with regard to the US government, the monetary system, and how they interact with each other. Now, the truth is that how can you have an independent entity that was created with the stroke of a pen by one power and that can take it away with the stroke of a pen on the other hand? Not only that, but if you look throughout history, there have been many battles between the Fed and the government, but ultimately, and the Fed actually has a pretty good record, to be honest. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. But ultimately, when the Fed has to go sit in front of Congress and testify 2 times a year, if they were truly independent and didn't have to answer to anybody else, they wouldn't have to do that. But they do have to do that. And not only that, but they have to submit the money that they make. They have to remit that to the boss. And the boss is the government. So if they were truly independent, they wouldn't be remitting either the gains or the losses back to the US Treasury. But when there are gains, they do remit it back to the Treasury. And again, I think that in itself shows who is in power and who is not in power and whether they are fully independent or not. Now, that does not mean they don't have autonomy. It doesn't mean that they don't have an incredible amount of power. But the idea that they are independent and can just do whatever they want is wrong. But the reason we're talking about this today is because this is kind of front page news now. With Trump coming back into the White House and him wanting to consolidate not only power, but to consolidate strategy within the United States on all different areas, rather than have separate siloed agendas, he is looking to consolidate power over monetary policy. Now, we can argue for days whether this should be done, whether this is a good thing, whether this is a bad thing. But as many of you know who watch the show, we don't talk about what should be or what could be. We tend to talk about what is, because that is what really matters. And as we've talked about many times as well, the America First policy is the policy that the Trump administration is trying to implement throughout all different areas and segments of government, whether it's the State Department dealing with overseas, whether it's the FBI dealing domestically, whether it's import duties or tariffs, whether it is foreign aid, whether it is economic policy, whether it is social policy, whether it is monetary policy. As of now, gone are the days where each of these different silos or each of these different areas of the government acted independently and at their own agenda. Trump is now attempting, at least, to consolidate all those and make all of the overarching policies of all of those America first. And so it's not surprising that he is trying to also consolidate power over monetary policy. The reason is because Trump wants to be seen as a fantastic businessman who's overseeing a fantastic economy. And obviously monetary policy plays a big part in that. But it's not just about domestic policy. It's also about international policy. Again, these are all one policy now, or at least that's where it's headed. And there is no bigger tool or weapon or influencer than money. Money runs the world. And so the idea that they wouldn't want to have control over money is a bit naive. But part of the reason, again, that this is coming up now is because there are many, Trump especially, who thinks that Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve has not done a good job. And they think that he should have cut rates already, and they think he should be cutting rates. And so they are now trying to get him to do that. And he is, so far, holding out, saying, no, we don't take politics into consideration, and we don't think it's the right time to do that. And so because he has not yet been able to get him to change Trump, because Trump has not yet been able to get Powell to change course just through browbeating him in the press, they're now moving towards other options. The Treasury Secretary, Bessent, has come out and said the president has the power to remove him for cause if he so chooses. Now, Trump has so far said he's not planning on doing it. I think we all know that that's probably not true, but that's what he has said so far. But the reason it makes it really interesting now is because rather than just browbeating him in the press, now they're going to go after him using other methods. And the method that appears that they are going to use now is potentially perjury when testifying before Congress. And not only that, but they're going to try to remove him, or potentially going to try to remove him for cause, because he hasn't done a good job. And so now Trump has his lieutenants in the government or in the Congress starting to make noise about this as well. And so, I think you may have heard me say many times, and I've probably first said this 3 or 4 years ago, but that we are moving towards a time where the Fed and the Treasury, basically the myth of the independent central bank will be thrown out the window, and the Fed and the Treasury will be merged, and all of those actions will be done under one roof. And so I've kind of joked around with my friend George Gammon, who is popular for the saying "in the Fed," to be careful what you wish for, because they may very well end the Fed, but it may just get rolled up into the Treasury Department, and so the Treasury Department could then run both policies. But part of the reason they can't just do it right away, and why it could take a while for this all to play out, and taking a while could actually cause quite a bit of uncertainty and chaos in global markets. And that's why we're talking about it. But one of the reasons why it may take a little while goes back to something else we have talked about many times, and that is the separation of powers. That's what the United States is built on. The United States is built on no kings, no one person that has all control, and that we've got these 3 different branches that continually fight for power, and as such continually check the power of the other 2. So we have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, and we have the judicial branch, right? And so as of right now, so far, the legislative side that is on Trump's side, in other words, the Republicans, are so far acting like they will support Trump in this. We haven't really heard from the Democrats on this issue yet, but I would be surprised if the Democrats just rolled over and automatically gave Trump what he wanted on this. Now, if the Democrats were in control, they would love to get the power of the Fed under their purview as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But what I thought we would talk about a little bit today is the history of the independent Fed and the history of times when we've had these battles between the Fed and the executive branch. Now, we already talked about how, this was the Fed was created by the stroke of a pen. It was created a few days before Christmas in 1913. So it was a great Christmas present for the banking system, or those running the central bank, perhaps I should say. But it was signed into law. And since that time, there have been several times where there has been a battle between the central bank and the executive branch. Let me just pull this up here. I made a quick little list. So you might have a little bit of trouble seeing this, but essentially, since World War II, there's been 5 or 6 instances where we've had this battle. Now, I talked about this on a previous episode a couple of months ago. A couple of months ago, we did a show talking about how gold could be revalued. And in that show, we covered this as well, because for gold to be revalued, the Treasury needs cooperation from the central bank. In other words, the Treasury can't revalue gold all on their own, or at least operationally, they can't make it happen all on their own. They need cooperation from the Fed to do it. But we talked about it then, but I'll go into a little bit more detail now. But the post-World War II, The first big battle was between Truman and the Fed. And essentially, Truman wanted low rates because even though World War II was over, now they're fighting the Korean War. And he felt that the higher rates that were being levied by the Federal Reserve was hindering his ability to effectively fight that war. And it got rather ugly. So much, and it was back and forth in the press. And ultimately, they came to this agreement, and it's called, in 1951, and it's called the Treasury and the Fed Accord. And it established again that the Fed was independent of the executive branch, and they did not have to do just whatever the executive branch said. And so that was a big win for the Fed. Fast forward, 10 or 15 years, and now we're in the middle of the 60s, and now the Vietnam War is starting. And now Lyndon Johnson is the president, and William McKenzie Martin is I think that's his name, is now the Fed chair. And once again, inflation's a little bit high, so Martin has interest rates higher than LBJ would like, and LBJ was insisting that he drop rates, and Martin just wouldn't do it. And so it went so far as Johnson summoned Martin to his ranch in Texas and basically told him it's his fault that some of the boys were dying over in Vietnam, and he was making it harder to fight the war, and as he's costing Americans lives. And he literally threw Martin up against a wall, put his finger in his chest, and he said, "You're going to lower rates." And to his credit, Martin did not do it. So, again, this was a big public battle, and Martin, for the most part, held his ground. Now, fast forward again, another maybe now 6-7 years, and now we are in the early 70s. And again, with all of the social programs and domestic programs that Nixon is running, plus trying to fight a war in Vietnam, and he wants Burns to cut rates. And Burns initially says no, but he ultimately acquiesces to Nixon and cuts rates. And then we had obviously everybody, or at least has heard of, the great inflation of the 70s. And that is what ushered in the next the next episode. And so, in the late 70s, then Volcker comes in. Or I should say, Burns kind of has gone down in history as one of the weaker Fed chairmen because of this. And so all subsequent Fed chairmen are very, very much trying to protect their own legacy against being another Burns. Very much Powell as well. We'll talk about that. But anyway, so in the late 70s, then Volcker comes in as the Federal Reserve chairman. And, not only was Volcker a strong personality, but he was like a big guy. I think he's like 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", big, imposing guy, smoked big cigars. And, he, in order to crush inflation, he just kept raising rates over and over and over again. And everybody thought that he would stop, and he just kept doing it. And, publicly, both Carter and Reagan felt like the recession that we were in at that point was, again, partly due to Volcker's actions, and they very much wanted him to cut rates, but he didn't do it. Now, then we get into, fast forward. Now I think it's in the late 80s. I don't remember exactly. I want to say it was like 86 or 87 when Greenspan then becomes the Fed chair. And once again, in the early 90s, we're in not a hard recession, but we're in a recession. George Bush Sr. is running for re-election, and he very much wants Greenspan to cut rates. Greenspan won't do it. And ultimately, Bush ends up losing that election to Clinton. And if you remember, the catchphrase from that election was, "It's the economy, stupid." And that was something that the Clinton came up with. And it was genius because it just, it summarized everything into one little thing. Bush is going around saying everything's pretty good. Meanwhile, we're in a recession. And that was the way that Clinton really connected with Main Street and ended up beating Bush in the presidency. And so we didn't really have a whole lot of, angst between the Fed and the Treasury really for the next 20 years or 15 years. And the reason is because Greenspan was very easy on monetary policy. He kept rates pretty low. He raised them a little bit, after 9, in like 2003 or 4. But by the time we started to get into, the right before the .com, then he started, or I'm sorry, before the Fed, the financial crisis, he started cutting rates again. And then Bernanke came in, and Bernanke was obviously, very dovish and provided an incredible amount of easy monetary policy. So there wasn't really any reason for the Treasury for the executive branch to be upset with the Fed. I do remember that this is kind of interesting, and it shows that both sides, whether you're Republican or Democrat, they both want easy money. I think I want to say it was like 2013 or 14. And the Fed had obviously done a lot of QE up into that point. And I think maybe now they were thinking about doing QE too, but had not yet done it yet. And Bernanke is testifying before Congress. And Chuck Schumer, who's a Democratic senator from New York, is basically grilling him on why he's not doing more to support the economy and why he's not doing more to, stimulate growth. And he basically says, you're the only game in town, get going. And so he was very much trying to get Bernanke to be even more dovish than he already was. But really, for a lot of that period of time, monetary policy was so dovish anyway. There wasn't a whole lot of angst between the Treasury, the executive branch and the Fed until Trump became president again. And if you remember, the Fed had not raised rates forever, for a really long time, and had done a lot of QE. And then right before Trump comes in, I think it was at the end of 2015, I think they did one token 25 basis point raise at the end of 2015. And then Trump wins in 2016. And then that's when now Yellen's the Fed chair, she starts raising rates again. And she didn't raise rates a lot, but she raised rates a little bit. And of course, Trump was saying, well, why are you raising rates against me? You didn't raise rates against anybody else. And so that kind of started it. And then, Trump actually, nominated Powell, which is funny because now he's saying he can't believe that he got confirmed, even though Trump is the one that put him forward to be confirmed. But then, in 2018, Powell started raising rates, and, Trump didn't like it, obviously. And then he thought they were being political. And, then Trump ended up losing in 2020 to Biden. And then, of course, they didn't do any raises under Biden initially, and until 2022. So for the first 2 years they didn't, and then they raised rates aggressively, and then again cut right before the last election, right? And that was widely seen as a political move going into the election, because they haven't cut since, and in many cases the data shows they should have been cutting now more so than when they cut then. And then not only that, but it was a couple years ago. I want to say it was, I don't know, maybe 2019, 2020. Dudley, the former Fed chairman, basically put out an opinion piece. I can't remember if it was New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, basically saying they should use monetary policy to keep Trump out of the White House. So the idea that the Fed is, completely agnostic and not political at all is a bit ridiculous. And the idea that they're an independent and then the government has no recourse to them is a bit ridiculous as well. So that's where we're at now. I think this is probably going to heat up in Q3. One of the things that is going to hurt Powell in this battle is the Fed has been renovating their building in Washington, D.C. And the cost to renovate, this is just one building, and they're not even building a brand new building. They're just renovating the old one. I mean, it's so ridiculous. The cost to renovate this building is $2.5 billion. Now they'll say it's all self-funding. We're only using the money that we're making, and we're not, the government isn't paying for this. But that's essentially bullshit. And the reason is because, again, when the Federal Reserve makes money after through their operations, after paying for their overhead and their salaries and stuff, they remit the profits back to the Treasury. So, if they're spending 2.5 billion, that's 2.5 billion that the government isn't getting back. And again, a $2.5 billion remodel. And so this is what I think the executive branch and the legislative branch that is so far with Trump, I think is really going to use to just hammer Powell in the press and in the media and trying to get Joe Main Street on their side. And listen, how is Joe Main Street not going to think this is absolutely ridiculous to spend 2.5 billion on a remodel? And not only how getting them to think that, but how isn't spending $22.5 billion on a remodel completely ridiculous? Of course it's ridiculous, but it's just very, very apropos of the type of environment that we're in right now. It's completely ridiculous. And now, and Powell knows that he looks ridiculous, and Powell's already starting to do backpedaling and saying, no, it's not as much you think, and da da da. But listen, the optics are just really, really bad for the central bank. And so, again, I think we're just moving faster along to where these two entities are ultimately going to get merged together in some form or another. But so far, but again, if we go back to that list that we just went through, the Fed has a pretty good track record. They're at least 50-50, and you could argue they've won 75% of these battles. But ultimately, I think they're going to lose this battle, and I think they're going to lose the battle of popular opinion. Again, whether you like Trump or hate Trump, it doesn't matter. He is popular, and he is a very populist president. And if he goes out there and starts railing against the crazy bankers in Washington, D.C., if you don't think that's going to resonate with the public, you're just not paying attention. It's absolutely going to resonate with the public. So I think, even though I don't like the idea of the central bank getting rolled up into the Treasury, again, it doesn't matter what I like. What matters is what's going to happen, and I think it's only a matter of time before this happens. Now, perhaps it takes a couple of years. Maybe it takes 4 years. I don't know. Maybe it happens right away, but I don't know the timeline. But that's where it's headed, and I think ultimately the executive branch will win this one. I would say that if Powell were to resign or step down, or if he were to get fired and accept it and not fight it, I think the news of it would probably cause markets to sell off pretty hard for a day or two. But after that, I think they'd probably rally because they know whoever Trump brings in is going to be an easy money president or an easy money Fed chair, and it's going to be back to a lot of liquidity, and assets probably rally because the uncertainty would be gone and the liquidity would be coming. But if it's drawn out, which I would expect it to be drawn out, I would be very surprised if Powell just rolled over and walked away and accepted being fired, or I don't think he would resign. So I would expect him to battle it. And that battle, I think, could cause, on the news of him being fired, if and when it comes, I would imagine markets would sell off. And if he fights it and says, "I'm taking this to the Supreme Court," then you could have a long time of uncertainty and a lot of volatility in the markets that would last longer than just a couple days. Anyway, that's my view on the Fed. What's going on? There's a Fed meeting next week, and I'm sure they're not going to cut rates. And so, after that, Trump will probably go crazy. Or is it next week? Maybe 2 weeks. Maybe the Fed's in 2 weeks. And so I think this is a time where this is going to get talked out more and more. Listen, it wouldn't surprise me if tomorrow morning we wake up and there's a headline saying that Jerome Powell has been fired. And we come into chaos on Monday. But maybe it takes a month, maybe it takes 2 months. I sit here and say I do not know the timing. I've just said for a very long time that this is where we're headed, and it seems like we're getting closer and closer to that destination. Now, what I thought I would do, I'm just going to go over. Oh, sorry, let me remove this. Go over a few other little charts. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Here we go. I'm not going to go over a lot of charts here today, but I just thought I'd show you this. You've seen me talk about this a lot. Basically, this is the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq is basically at its all-time high. The relative strength is very overbought. The stochastics are as high as they can be. We've got a number of catalysts over the nenext month or so. Again, we've got a Fed meeting coming up. We've got all the tariffs coming back into play on August 1st. Markets just don't go in a straight line. So I'm not going to sit here and say that we can't move higher, but markets don't move in a straight line. We've got those two catalysts I just mentioned. Earnings are kicking off here, and so we've got a number of potential catalysts in earnings. And, this whole Fed and Treasury and executive branch thing is hanging out there. And we've got a lot of these geopolitical issues that are still ongoing. So I would expect that in Q3 here, we have, elevated volatility. Whether we go all the way back down to where we were in April, I'm not sure about that. But I do expect volatility. And it just shows you everything is very overbought. Everything's back at its high. The cost to hedge on technology is as low as it's been, and everybody's on one side of the boat essentially. So again, I don't know that doesn't necessarily mean we have to have a crash. It just means that the table is set, that if we get any kind of catalyst for uncertainty, it wouldn't take a whole lot to send this market back lower. So I'm prepared for that. Oh, and the other thing, and you guys know I love this indicator. Yesterday, Mercury went back into retrograde. And I always get a bunch of comments whenever I mention this. And I first of all, I think it's pretty funny. I think it's just a fun indicator to kind of follow and watch and see what happens. But I'll say this, and I've probably said this before, but I'll say it again, is, the heavens, whether the moon, the stars, the planets, they all affect the biggest entity on Earth, and that is the ocean. So the idea that those things can affect the biggest entity on Earth, but yet you as an individual or us as a society or us as market participants are not affected, I think is a bit naive. So I'll just leave that there. In any case, it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks. I'll be back again next week and we can talk about this some more. Hope you guys all have a great week ahead, and we'll talk to you soon.